As Officer Daniel Hayes navigated Willow Creek's peaceful streets in his patrol cruiser every evening, his thoughts frequently. Sam, his devoted German shepherd, who had died 3 years before, was more than just a dog. It was. The loss of Daniel's best friend, companion, and guardian had left a hole. Something appeared to occupy no amount of time, and the subtle hum was the same tonight. Daniel hardly paid attention to the radio as it filled the car, but as he passed the abandoned railroad tracks, something attracted his attention. Daniel put the brakes on hard as he saw a dog dash across the dark road, evading oncoming vehicles. Racing, the dog was frozen on the side of the road, its dark fur matted and soaked from the drizzle as he got out of the car. Daniel briefly lost his breath since the dog had a striking resemblance to Sam. The same powerful build was penetrating Amber's eyes, as though Sam had returned to life. "Hello there, friend," Daniel muttered quietly as the dog crouched and gave a low growl, body tight, but there was a mixture of recognition and dread in its eyes. Remark caused Daniel to pause, so he extended his hand cautiously without making any abrupt motions. "It's okay," Daniel whispered. "Won't harm you." The dog cautiously moved forward before another Daniel saw. He carefully grasped the faded collar around its neck, the metal tag gleaming in the streetlight. His gut dropped when he felt his fingertips touch the tag. The tag read Sam Hayes. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His thoughts were racing as he flipped the tag over in an attempt to find further hints. An address from his former residence was inscribed on the back. The one he had shared with Sam was inconceivable, and he felt his heart racing. Sam had passed away, and they had buried him in. Daniel's trance was broken by the dog's quiet whimpering in the backyard of that exact house. It leaned into his hand as though. Daniel felt a knot in his throat as he sought solace. How could this puppy have? What did Sam's tag have to do with the companion he had lost? "Let's get you out of the rain," Daniel remarked at last. He opened the car door with a shaky voice, and the dog immediately hopped in. Daniel's mind was racing with thoughts as he drove toward the precinct, but he was positive that this dog had delivered Sam, returned to his life, and he was resolved to learn how the precinct. As usual, the station was bustling with late-night activity, with officers typing reports, dispatchers relaying calls, and the smell of old coffee permeated the air as Daniel entered with the dog, which he had now covered in his extra jacket to keep it safe. Officer Hayes, a fresh recruit, joked as he walked to his desk, turning heated heads. Daniel responded with a strained voice as Marquez raised an eyebrow or something. The dog lay motionless with its eyes as he sat down and gently laid it on an old blanket he had discovered in the break room. Intent on Daniel, as though attempting to convey a message, Daniel grabbed his phone and snapped a photo of the tag. Subsequently forwarded it to Sarah, his former spouse Daniel, who simply happened to stumble over it. As he waited for a response, he actually stared at the screen. A few minutes later, the phone rang, asking Sarah whether this was a prank. Tag was buried, and Sam Daniel slumped back in his chair, his gut churning. It couldn't be a coincidence that his gaze kept going to the dog. He had to know more. Opened his laptop and looked through microchip databases, hoping to find out who owned the dog if it had an implant. Address questions regarding the tag. Daniel took a microchip scanner out of the evidence room and scanned the dog's neck. A slight beep indicated that a chip was present, and a number appeared on the screen. Daniel entered the dog's name into the database, and a file appeared. However, what he saw left him even more perplexed. The owner, an elderly woman called Martha Blake, who resided in 2 towns over the river, was identified as Shadow. Shadow, a recent veterinary visit was only 2 weeks ago, Daniel said as he looked at. The dog's name didn't seem appropriate. It seemed as if the dog didn't. He retrieved Martha Blake's contact details and contacted the number in response to it. The phone rang twice before a weak voice said, "Hello, Mrs. Blake. This is Willow Creek, Officer Hayes. PD, I think I discovered a dog, Shadow." The woman paused for a long moment before responding, her voice shaking. "Shadow are." Daniel stated that the ID fits, but Shadow is missing. "Are you certain I scanned his microchip?" Another pause, followed by Martha's voice cracking, "And he vanished 3 days ago. I've had him for 6 years. I don't understand how he could be there." Daniel frowned. "Did you adopt him?" He was taken in as a stray, but he's always been unusual, as if he remembers. Martha said from the shelter. Upon hearing the words, Daniel looked at the dog, whose gaze never left his face, and felt a chill run down his spine. In an effort to maintain his composure, he added, "I'll bring him to you in the morning." "Thank you, Officer Martha," she said. After hanging up, Daniel leaned back in his chair and thought about the 6 years that had nearly passed. Shadow couldn't have been Sam at the precise moment of Sam's death. However, the dog moaned. The likeness was uncanny, and the tag was incomprehensible. Its amber eyes, full of unsaid passion, pushed Daniel's palm with its nose, jolting him out of his reverie. Felt a rush of nostalgia and scratched behind its ears. "You're not Sam," he muttered quietly, "but you're here. It was for a cause, aren't you?" That night, the dog placed its head on Daniel's lap after tilting it as though it understood. Daniel stayed at the station with the dog, browsing through old pictures of Sam on his phone since he couldn't sleep. Pictures brought back memories of Sam defending the area, chasing tennis balls, and he recalled the day Sam died, the piercing anguish of loss, and spending long hours resting his head on Daniel's knee. Daniel had always questioned whether there was anything more he could have done to save himself because of the guilt that followed him. Dawn went up to Daniel, who decided to give Shadow back to Martha Blake. However, he had to go to Sam's cemetery first. The house on Matthew Street was deserted. Now that weeds have taken over the once vibrant garden, Daniel parked his car and the air was silent and chilly as they headed to the backyard, the dog trailing closely behind. A tiny gravestone bearing the inscriptions was situated beneath a robust oak tree, the morning dew still clinging to the grass. Daniel, Sam Hayes' lifelong friend and partner protector, knelt next to his heart was heavy, and the dog sat next to him, staring at the stone for a. They remained like that man and dog for a long time, joined by an invisible thread. "I'm not sure how or why you're here. If you're a part of Sam and you're here to tell me something, I'm listening," Daniel said in a whisper, his voice breaking. Daniel put his palm on the gravestone and closed his eyes as the dog leaned against him and let out a low whine. He experienced a sense of peace in the quiet that he hadn't had in years, as though Sam's spirit was still keeping watch over him. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on Daniel when he opened his eyes. "Come on, Shadow," Daniel replied, feeling for the first time that he was being led toward answers rather than searching for them. Daniel drove quietly as the sun rose, finally getting to his feet to see where this would take him. Sky Shadow sat quietly in the passenger seat as it crawled higher into the morning. The steady buzz of the tires on the street appeared to accompany the head resting on the dashboard as it observed the world go by, matched the cadence of Daniel's thoughts as he got closer to the Martha Blake address, a knot of uneasiness settling in his chest. What if Shadow's return simply made the enigma more complex? Or worse, what if it made him more curious about the questions he didn't want or couldn't respond? Martha Blake's home was a small cottage with a garden full of wild. While Daniel stopped on the gravel driveway and got out, the dog appeared to be by his side. Martha opened its mouth hesitantly, its ears perking at the sound of birds stewing close. Her petite form was covered in a woolen shawl, and her gentle eyes glistened behind the door before Daniel could knock. As the dog ran toward her, she knelt down and put her arms around it, saying, "Oh, Shadow, thin-framed glasses. I feared I had lost you forever." But Shadow returned her devotion, her voice quivering with relief. Daniel caught the moment and experienced a pang of remorse because he didn't own this dog, but it was directed toward him as though he was trying to get acceptance. "Thank you, Officer Hayes," Martha said. It was difficult not to feel possessive of the bond they had formed in such a short period of time. "Getting up with effort," Daniel remarked. "I don't know how to repay you, no need." Martha scowled as she said, "But there's something I need to ask you." Daniel started by dropping to the tag that was still hanging from Shadow's collar and touching it with shaking fingertips. "Was buried with my dog Sam's face after he passed away 6 years ago. I'm pale. Could you tell me where you got Shadow or anything that could?" What Martha meant when she gestured for Daniel to accompany her into the living room was, comfortable with bookshelves and framed family photos, Shadow rests by the hearth as though it were his typical location, his gaze never leaving Daniel's eye. Martha described how she acquired Shadow from a shelter, where he was taken in as a stray some 6 years ago and settled into an armchair. "Do you recall which shelter Daniel pressed?" They told me a while back that he had been on the loose for weeks before someone discovered him. She responded, Golden Pores and Millhaven are amazing folks who save so. A lot of animals following that awful storm. Daniel nodded, his thoughts racing. Golden. After a hurricane struck the neighborhood 6 years ago, the same year Sam had passed away, Paws gained notoriety for saving strays. Daniel, may I borrow Shadow for a little while longer? Shadow was displaced during that period, but that didn't explain the tag. Martha hesitated as she said, I need to follow up at the shelter, and I think Shadow might be the key. He's always been special, she whispered gently, her gaze darting to the puppy. Daniel couldn't deny that he was grateful, since it seems like he carries a piece of everyone who has ever loved him. For her time, Martha promised to get Shadow back in the car with Daniel as soon as possible. The woman who answered the Golden Paws phone seemed professional and upbeat, but her tone changed when Daniel stated the time frame in Shadow's description, and after a pause, she continued, he was a rare case that came in after. We were terrified by the hurricane, but because of their amazing fortitude, we were unable to locate any owner documents. Daniel's heart quickened again. Microchip without tags. Are you? The woman stated that we would have recorded it if he had a tag. So why do you? Daniel's grasp tightened on the phone for no apparent reason. Thank you for your assistance. Hung up, wondering how he would have been saved if Shadow hadn't had a tag. That night, Daniel sat in his living room, wondering if he would wind up with Sam's. Sam's old collar was on the coffee table, and it was strangely quiet except for the occasional sound of Shadow shifting while he slept. The realization came to him like a freight train after he had been avoiding the small box of souvenirs for years. The tag and collar were in fine condition, but he recalled that on the day they buried Sam, the tag had been firmly attached to the collar, abandoned his cherished buddy under the oak tree, and awoke from his. After stretching and stretching, he padded over to Daniel, who was sleeping on the officer's lap. Daniel scratched absently behind the, What are you trying to tell me, boy? He whispered, his dog's ears fixed on the collar, as though it contained all the answers. The room became heavy with unanswered questions as Shadow's tail thudded once against the floor, and Daniel knew there was more to. Even though he couldn't see it yet, Shadow's presence was evident. It wasn't arbitrary, and as the night became darker, Daniel composed his. He could get the answers he was looking for if he went back to Sam's cemetery tomorrow. We're buried in the past rather than the present, and the sun had a hard time penetrating the dense layer the next morning. Daniel drove toward the park where the world was a muted gray due to the clouds. The collar and tag weighed heavily in Sam's pocket as Shadow rode silently next to him after he was buried. The familiar surroundings of the parking lot served as an anchor to memories and questions that would not leave him. He was welcomed by the park, the playground where kids used to giggle, and the jogging path that he and Sam had traveled on many times. At times, everything seemed uncannily the same, as though it had been frozen in time since Sam's death. When Daniel opened the car door, Shadow leaped out, his nose twitching as he smelt the. With a knot in his gut, Daniel took a tiny shovel from the trunk in the cold morning air. He wasn't proud of what he was going to do, but he needed to be aware that the massive limbs of the old oak tree, which towered over the park, reached. They had placed Sam to rest here in a peaceful location away from the bustle of the outside world, like protective arms. Shadow jogged ahead of Daniel as his steps slowed as he got closer to the memories that were returning in vivid detail. With intention, he paused at the tree's base, rubbing his nose on the ground, and then, to Daniel's surprise, the dog. Daniel froze when he let out a deep, melancholy howl. The sound sent shivers down his spine. He shook his head in an attempt to concentrate, but it was only a type of melancholy cry he hadn't heard since Sam's last days. Coincident Shadow was unable to comprehend the significance of this location, so he knelt beside the tree, his hand shaking as he. The earth was heavy and wet when he shoved the shovel into it, and every motion felt like a betrayal. Darling Sam Shadow stood quietly close by, his amber eyes fixed on Daniel's for a few minutes. Changed to an hour, and at last the small wooden box's edge was visible. As he removed the ground around it, Daniel's heart pounded. He stopped, his breath seizing in his throat, and then, cautiously, Daniel sat while he lifted the old but undamaged box out of the earth. He buried this box himself, using Sam's collar to seal it, and he was back on his heels, his fingers grazing the lid. He took a deep breath and opened it to reveal a few of his favorite toys. Daniel gazed at him, defying explanation. The collar was there, neatly coiled as he had left it, but the tag was gone. His thoughts were racing, and he could still clearly recall the day he secured the collar, the weight of it, and the shine of the tag. Shadow gave a quiet sigh. It must have been there the last time. Daniel glanced down at the dog on his chest as the whining nudged his arm with his nose, seemingly to jolt him out of his reverie. The box was carefully placed on the passenger seat, and he tightened his grip, thinking that the drive home would be silent. Every logical answer crumbled beneath the weight of Daniel's thoughts as Shadow curled up in the back. Considering what he had witnessed, was he becoming insane? Had he forgotten by the time he was more perplexed than ever when he got home and set the box on the kitchen table, gazing at its contents as though perhaps they will suddenly explain Sam's old ball, his favorite blanket, and the collar. Except for the missing tag, everything was in order. Shadow padded into the kitchen and sat next to Daniel with a. Daniel took the tag out of his pocket and held it up to the light of the scratches with a calm patience that seemed almost human. There was no question that the clothing and every aspect matched what he remembered. "Why do you have this?" Daniel muttered, his voice shaking. "This was Sam's tag. Could you please tilt this Shadow's head so that his eyes are gentle but unreadable?" When Daniel returned the following day, the shelter where Martha had taken in Shadow Golden Paws was a hive of activity. Daniel went to the front desk with the tag as the sounds of happy volunteers and barking dogs filled the air. Holding his hand tightly, he said to the shelter manager and receptionist, "I need to talk to someone about Shadow." In a little office filled with adoption pictures, Daniel met a sweet-faced woman named Beth and gave her the rundown on everything. Tagged the grave, he listened intently, feeling a strange connection to Shadow Beth. She finally said, "I've worked here for years, and I've seen some," her face growing more solemn with every revelation. Strange stories of animals returning to their family in spite of all odds. But she shook her head and said, "I haven't." Desperation began to seep into Daniel's question. "Is there anyone who might know more about Shadow's history?" Beth's voice wavered. Then she softly added, "Dr. Laura Kane. She's a." After the hurricane, we collaborated with a veterinary researcher who focused on situations involving traumatized animals like shadows. She gave Daniel a distinctive behavior pattern and said, "If anyone can help, it's her." Dr. Laura Kane's name was displayed in huge letters on his business card as he walked out of. Perhaps a glimmer of hope as Shelter Shadow walked steadily by him. Later that day, Daniel, perhaps Dr. Kane might provide insight into the mystery that had completely upended his existence. Discovered himself seated in a comfortable office with bookshelves stacked high with studies on animal behavior and veterinary medicine. The subtle scent of lavender permeated the air, adding a soothing element to the otherwise sterile setting across from him on Saturday. Shadow was instantly at ease with Dr. Laura Kane, a calm, sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s. Daniel's head was resting on his paw at his feet, but his eyes were alert to the tag hanging there. From the light shining on Daniel's fingers as he described the enigmatic circumstances of Shadows, Dr. Kane listened intently to her hands as she arrived at the grave and the missing tag. Folding on her desk, she sat back in her chair and gave a contemplative nod when Daniel finished. "Unusual," she started, "but animals are, in my experience, far more perceptive than humans frequently realize, because they develop relationships with places, things, and even memories." But Daniel's voice was trembling a little when he pressed the button. How could it have wound up on Shadow, where it was buried alongside Sam? Dr. Kane paused to think about her answer, which is sometimes the most straightforward. Explanations are accurate, but is there a chance that another animal disturbed the grave? Maybe the teabag might have been taken away, lost, and somehow found Shadow. Daniel. He shook his. "I don't understand how I buried Sam so deeply, and the box remained undisturbed except from." Dr. Kane's countenance softened when the missing tag appeared, suggesting that we might be dealing with. Shadow's actions indicate that he understands you on a deeper level. Daniel, dogs have amazing memories for sense, and they can convey feelings about individuals and locations. If Shadow has ever met Sam, or even. Daniel scowled, thinking that something that held Sam's scent may explain the connection. But Sam had left before Shadow entered the scene, and he brought this tag up to the weathered surface, which was glistening in the sunlight coming through the window. Dr. Kane leaned forward, too specific to be a coincidence. Taking on a more scientific tone, there is a further possibility, albeit a more hypothetical one, since we have observed a few isolated instances in what is known as transference, in which an animal adopts preferences, behaviors, or even items attached to an animal with which they have a relationship. This frequently occurs with home pets or pack, but it has occasionally happened over longer transmission distances. Daniel repeated your statement that Shadow might have a lingering connection to. It's possible, Sam said thoughtfully, but it's difficult to say without knowing more about Shadow's past. Daniel undoubtedly gazed down at Shadow, who returned his glance with a look that seemed to know exactly how to. Do we discover that Dr. Kane gave him a folder with Shadow's adoption records in it? These are all the records that shelter because they could have a clue, but she added in a serious tone. Sometimes these trails don't lead to obvious answers, so you need to be ready. Daniel laid out the records, which described Shadow's admission to the shelter, on his kitchen table that evening. Discovered wandering the streets following a hurricane's destruction of a nearby town, where he had been undernourished, wary, and covered in debris, but generally in good condition. Daniel was drawn to one particular aspect of the intake form. Provided a tag number, but stated that because of the extensive effects of the hurricane, no owner could be located. Daniel's heart plummeted because it wasn't listed in the shelter's database. Another dead end, but the hurricane's remark gave him a thought. So he took out his laptop and started looking through stories on displaced people and news broadcasts from the storm. A black animal with a white patch on his breast and a little twisted tail stepped out from the shadows. In a flood of descriptions, he compared online forums and rescue reports with the location where Shadow was discovered. Hours went by with little progress for the groups looking for a lead when he stumbled. Although the photograph was grainy, it consistently depicted Shadow in a social media post from a rescue group. Daniel, sitting in a makeshift shelter with his white breast marking showing, clicked on the profile of the person who. The following morning, Daniel shared the post with a volunteer named Megan Torres, called Megan, and she recalled Shadow, whom we had referred to as Lucky at the time, in a kind and animated voice, was among the first dogs we saved during the storm. Despite his fear, he exuded a certain resolve. We always had the impression that he was looking for something. Do you know where he was located? Daniel questioned his. Voice full of optimism, Megan acknowledged that there is a lot of overlap in those circumstances. However, I do recall that we picked him up close to a dilapidated property just outside of town. The area appeared to be made mainly of abandoned trees. Debris was strewn everywhere, yet there was a broken fence that he might have entered. Daniel's thoughts were racing. Dan drove the following day, and this property contained the key to Shadow's pass to Sam's tag. The property was covered in weeds and covered in storm debris when Megan arrived at the site she had indicated. As they neared a fallen shed, he appeared vigilant, keeping his nose low to the ground. Stopped, his ears pricked up, and he gave a low, almost inquisitive bark before. Daniel ran toward the building, his heart racing. Shadow poured a heap of rubble, whimpering. Daniel gently knelt next to him and started to collect the debris from underneath the splintered wood and tangled. Daniel discovered another tag inside the small rusting doghouse that Vines had left. As he lifted it up, his breath hitched because it was just like Sam's. Daniel leaned back on his heels and gazed at the tag in his palm. Despite being covered in grime, its shape and the faint engraving engraved into it were unmistakable. Surface, size, and design were all the same as Sam's tag, and even the same Shadow sat next to him, his head cocked, as though he understood the importance of the revelation about how Daniel whispered as he turned the tag over in his hands, questions racing through his head. Was this a strange coincidence, or was there a reason why the tag was recreated? Deeper bond between Shadow and Sam that he was yet unable to understand. Shadow whined softly, nudging Daniel's. Daniel put the tag in his pocket and stood up, holding his nose in a way that seemed to encourage him to keep inhaling deeply. There was something eerily familiar about the rusty doghouse, even though it appeared to have been abandoned for years. The size and shape all evoked recollections that he was unable to pinpoint. Looked about the property, noticing a swaying, decaying porch swing and the remains of what may have been a garden. Shadow moved forward, nose to the ground, tail wagging purposefully in the breeze, and came to a stop close to A. Daniel joined him in stooping to observe what was happening as the fell mailbox scratched at the ground. Shadow had noticed the worn and battered mailbox with the name Collins barely visible behind the rust. He mumbled the name, Collins, and his pulse skipped a beat. The name gave him a shock, a slight memory pulling at his breath caught as memories came flooding back to him, and he reached out to steady himself on the mailbox post. Years prior, Sam had expressed a special interest in a nearby property on one of their daily walks. The house was modern but well-maintained, and Mrs. Collins, a happy woman who owned a dog, was frequently seen waving from her porch. Sam and Buddy, a playful black Labrador mix, quickly became friends, racing each other around the yard and pulling on toys, but the Collins family had abruptly moved Daniel. Recalled that days later, Sam would sit at the edge of their yard and look longingly at the now empty house as if, could this property be abandoned as he waits for his companion to return? And overlooked were formerly members of the Collins family. If so, how was Shadow? Linked to it and motivated by a sense of urgency, Daniel went back to his car and took out a notebook and pen, writing down his thoughts. Before taking pictures of the doghouse and the surrounding land, Shadow write down the address and the name Collins. Walked after him, wagging his tail as though he sensed they were onto something significant, and Daniel delved into. He conducted research by looking through historical social media posts, online forums, and public records. As he pieced together the Collins family's scattered facts, he found that they had moved after. A family tragedy occurred when their home was destroyed by fire, and Daniel, their cherished dog friend, felt his chest constrict as he read about the fire, which had happened only a few months prior to Sam's injury, and it clarified why the home, but prompted further inquiries regarding Shadow's presence there. Had a friend somehow survived the fire, or encountered Shadow's possessions? The answers were still unclear, but one detail. Notably, Miss Collins had been actively involved in rescue efforts, fostering homeless canines, storms, and other emergencies. Daniel might have discovered that the Shadow had. If that were the case, the tag and its relationship might make sense. He entered her care before making his way to the shelter. Daniel contacted the rescue group where Mrs. Collins had previously lived because he was determined to find out the truth. Volunteered, and after a number of phone conversations and emails, he was able to connect with her son Eric, who had assumed his mother's rescue efforts following her death and currently oversaw a small network of animal foster homes on A. Eric listened carefully to Daniel's story over a video conference. His eyes grew when Daniel gave him the tag that resembles one of the personalized tags my mother made for Eric. He said, leaning. Her heart would accelerate as she drew them closer to the screen, especially for the dog she had fostered for a long time. Eric said, "Do you think Shadow might have been one of those dogs?" Mom kept careful notes even when the phone was cut off, and Daniel sat back thinking. The storms allowed me to search our archives to see if I could locate anything. Whirling if Shadow's time with Mrs. Collins could be verified by Eric's records, it might ultimately give him the information he had been looking for. A week later, Eric called to let me know that I had discovered something. Displaying a beat-up notebook that belonged to my mother, it contained a message about a black mixed dog named Lucky. A crooked tail and a white patch on his breast caused Daniel's breath to catch. Shadow, Eric nodded, confirming that she had located him. She wrote that for a few months, he appeared to be attached to someone while strolling close to a storm that damaged property. Dog's possessions, a collar, and a tag that she thought belonged to a lost friend's Danielle chest, strengthened the tag that had been there all along, with Shadow somehow having a connection to Sam. Unfortunately, Daniel was left reeling by Eric's revelation. Shadow, or Lucky as Mrs. The reason Collins had phoned him wasn't random. His narrative was entwined with Sam's in ways Daniel was just starting to discover. It was difficult to understand the tag because of how much Sam's demeanor resembled. Daniel sat at his kitchen table as the pieces of a puzzle began to fit together, but the finished image was still elusive. Eric's notebook opened in front of him, and a Shadow was lying at his feet, his ears quivering as though he could feel the seriousness of Daniel's thoughts were racing Miss Collins's mind as he ran his fingertips over the notes Eric had supplied. Written a lot about Lucky in her journal, highlighting his kindness and peculiar bond with the tag sheet. Discovered that she had even guessed that Lucky might have been a member of a different family who had lost him in the storms. However, she had never been able to locate his original owners. Daniel closed the journal and looked at it. He whispered, "What's your story, boy?" while stroking behind Shadow's. Sam's shadow replied with a gentle tail wag and a prod of his ears, asking how you got here and how you know. Nose against Daniel's calf and his intense, soulful eyes meeting Daniel's. That caused his chest to hurt. Therefore, Daniel took the decision to go back and find out more. He hoped that the shelter where he had adopted Shadow would have more documents or hints on Shadow's history as. Shadow was sitting quietly in his kennel when he pulled into the parking lot, memories of that tragic day coming back. Clara, the shelter manager, gave Daniels a warm greeting as their eyes locked, as though he had been waiting for him inside. "It's nice to see you, Daniel. How is Shadow doing?" "He's incredible," Daniel answered, his voice with a hint of emotion. "But I believe there's more to his tale than I first thought. Do you have any other documents regarding?" Clara furrowed her brow. "Let me check," saying, "If you know anything that could tell me where he came from before coming here." Guiding him to her office, where she went through computer logs and files before removing a folder containing. "Here are Shadow's intake documents. A volunteer brought Shadow in after discovering, with only a single tag bearing the name Lucky Daniel, and no microchip or collar. He was found wandering close to a roadway. His heart beat." As Clara went on, "He was afraid and undernourished, but he quickly warmed up, which is typical for. We always attempt to track down the origins of dogs that arrive to us with tags or collars from former homes. However, in Shadow's case, when we came to a standstill, Daniel showed Clara the tag he had discovered. How does it look?" Clara looked at it carefully, her eyes widening. It looked like one of Mrs. Before she went away, Collins' tags used to foster for us. She had a special bond with dogs, especially those who had been. Daniel agreed. If Shadow was with her, he was in good hands through trauma. Rumors that Ms. Collins was the beginning of Shadow's journey. But the relationship to Sam was still unknown. So that night Daniel sat in his living room and gazed at a picture of Sam. With his head resting on Daniel's lap, the Shadow was next to him. The similarity between. Not only did the old pictures of Shadow and Sam look strange, but Shadow's head tilt when Daniel. The tag weighted heavy in Daniel's pocket, and when he appeared to be deep in contemplation, someone spoke or nudged him for attention, pulled it out, and held it up to the light. Sam thought that the etching was faint but still readable. Felt both reassuring and unnerving to be able to carry a bit of Sam with him. "I believe Sam sent you to me," Daniel whispered. "I don't know how, but I sensed that he didn't want me to be alone," while Shadow whimpered softly and licked. The following week, Daniel paid Eric another visit, bringing Shadow along for the discussion, as if to reassure him. Eric shared more heartbreaking tales of Miss Collins's steadfast commitment to puppy rescue. But there were still unanswered concerns regarding Sam's tag and Shadow's relationship to him. "I wish I could give you more," Eric replied as they waited on his porch. But perhaps knowing that the Shadow made his way is more important than discovering all the answers. Dan nodded, his eyes straying to Shadow, who was using his tail to explore Eric's yard when you most needed him. "Hey, perhaps you're correct," he said, "but it still seems like I'm missing that evening when Daniel had in a vivid dream. He and Sam were strolling down a well-known trail as the sun was sinking in a flaming orange and pink. Sam turned. "I'm always with you, Dad," he responded, his face beaming with a contented smile. "You simply need to find me." Shadow was cuddled up next to Daniel as he woke up, pressing his warm body into his side. The dream persisted, giving him clarity and serenity. Maybe it was Eric. Shadow's appearance, his striking likeness to Sam, and the incomprehensible. Relationships were gifts rather than coincidences, and perhaps that was sufficient. Dream continued to torment Daniel in the most consoling way each time when he glanced at Shadow, he sensed an implicit connection that appeared to go beyond simple friendship. He was more than simply a dog. He served as a reminder of Sam's steadfast devotion and love. Daniel made the decision to revisit the road from his dream the following morning in order to honor Sam's and Shadow's story. As they drove to the forest preserve, Daniel knew that a trail he hadn't traveled in years was one that Sam had cherished while he was alive. Feeling both anxious and excited, he wasn't sure what he was looking for, but felt obliged to follow As they exited the vehicle, the cool autumn air welcomed them. Shadow eagerly sniffed the ground with his tail. Daniel, wagging with delight, adjusted the strap of his rucksack, which was filled with water, munchies, and an old picture of Sam. When he said, "Ready, boy," Shadow barked once, and his eyes brightened before they started. Daniel couldn't resist as he followed the meandering route into the forest, which was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and bird music. Think of all the times he and Sam had strolled this identical path, pausing to play or admire the tree's beauty. Halfway through the trail, the recollections were vivid, bittersweet, and oddly reassuring. Daniel stopped at a well-known area. He and Sam would always stop there to rest on a fallen tree. Log had taken the lake scene beyond. Shadow scurried forward and sniffed at the log. His actions before returning to Daniel were very identical to Sam's, as though he knew this location contained significance. Daniel took a seat on the log and took out the picture of Sam from his backpack. He then traced Sam with his finger. Shadow sat next to him and whispered, "You loved it here," his face squeezing his neck. As Daniel sat in contemplation, he silently supported him by rubbing his body on his leg. A couple came up on the man waved as they followed their golden dog, who was galloping joyfully ahead of them. Daniel nodded, saying, "It's a lovely day, isn't it?" The woman grinned. "He's gorgeous," Daniel said, scratching behind him. "What's his name?" Shadow was the focus of the man's attention. "You know, he reminded me of a dog I adopted a few months ago. Sam was always wearing a tag when I used to see this large golden retriever around here." Daniel explained slowly that my dog, Sam, had died a few years ago. After exchanging glances, the woman remarked softly, "I'm sorry for your loss, Sam. Was well liked by everyone on this trail and had a way of making people smile." Daniel's chest clenched. The man pointed at Shadow. "It sounds like him. The way he's staring at you. It almost seems like he's continuing Sam's legacy." Sam used to give Daniel the same look right now. He looked at Shadow, who had his eyes fixated on him with an expression of unflinching devotion. It made him shudder, but not out of dread of wonder. Daniel sat in startled silence as the couple proceeded down the trail. Was it a coincidence, or was there more to it? It was impossible to overlook Shadow's apparent ability to capture Sam's essence in ways that went beyond simple physical similarity. His actions, including how he entered Daniel's life, seemed more than random. Shadow pushed Daniel's hand. Daniel smiled faintly as his nose snapped him out of his reverie. "You truly are something amazing, aren't you?" The water glistened in the afternoon sun as they proceeded along the path that led them to the lake's edge. And Daniel knelt down and wrapped his arms about himself after experiencing a profound sensation of calm. Around Shadow's neck, "Thank you," he said in a heartfelt murmur, "for reminding me of him by being here." Shadow licked Daniel's cheek and tail. Daniel sat down with the tag again that evening at home, wagging gently. Its significance had changed, feeling less like a mystery and more like a fragment of a bigger narrative that didn't require all. He put on a little chain and wrapped it around Shadow's neck in response to feel complete, saying, "I'm in awe of the." Shadow barked gently, almost in agreement, as it leaned against his fur. "It looks great on you." Over the following few days, Daniel found himself going back to locations that he and Sam had visited, always bringing Shadow with him. Every excursion created new memories and strengthened their relationship, and friends and neighbors started remarking on how content they were. Daniel appears to be a miracle because Shadow has restored his life's light. While having coffee, Daniel said to his friend Lisa, "I don't know how to explain it, but it's like Sam sent him to me," and Lisa grinned. Recognizing that the universe can operate in mysterious ways at times, perhaps it has nothing to do with. Daniel nodded, feeling a warm sensation in his chest. "I believe you're correct about the following." Over the weekend, Daniel made the decision to take Shadow to the dog park, which he hadn't been to since Sam's death. It was lively. Dogs of all sizes and breeds were running freely on a Saturday afternoon. With happy barking filling the air, Daniel paused at the gate, feeling burdened by memories of the past, but Shadow stood calmly by his side, encouraging Daniel to move forward as they. Shadow bounded toward a group of dogs as soon as he entered, his tail wagging with excitement. Daniel discovered a bench beneath the shade of a tree and observed, and for the first time in years, he felt a connection to the world and a sense of belonging. Withdrawn following Sam's death, a woman with a sleek black Labrador approached her dog at a trot while Shadow was playing. Alongside her thoughts, she gestured to the bench and said, "If I sit here?" Daniel replied, shifting slightly to make room. The woman smiled warmly. "I'm Jessica. And this is Luna," she said, gesturing to her dog, who was now sniffing at Shadow with interest. "I'm Daniel," he said. Shadow Jessica chuckled as the two dogs began to chase each other. "He's beautiful." "How long have you had him?" "Not long," Daniel admitted. "I adopted him a few months ago. He's been exactly what I needed." Jessica tilted her head, sensing the weight in his words. "It's amazing how dogs can heal us, isn't it?" "Luna came into my life after I lost my husband. I don't think I'd have made it through without her." Daniel nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I lost my dog a few years ago. Sam was more than just a pet. He was family." Shadow reminds me of him in ways I can't even explain." Jessica's eyes softened. "Maybe that's not a coincidence. Sometimes I think the ones we've lost find ways to stay with us, even if it's through someone or something new." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Daniel. "Maybe," he said softly, glancing at Shadow. "Maybe you're right." As the dogs continued playing, Daniel noticed something peculiar. Shadow, who had always been friendly but reserved around strangers, was now standing protectively in front of a small puppy that another dog was barking at aggressively. The scene mirrored an old memory of Sam at the very same park, stepping in to defend a timid chihuahua from a much larger dog. Daniel stood, his heart racing. "Shadow," he called gently. Shadow turned, his eyes meeting Daniel's. The look was unmistakable, loyal, fearless, and full of love. It was the same expression Sam had always worn in moments like these. The other dog's owner quickly intervened, pulling their pet away and apologizing profusely. Daniel knelt beside Shadow, running his hand through his fur. "Good boy," he whispered. Shadow licked his face, his tail wagging, as if to say, "I've got this." That evening, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was happening. He sat on the couch, Shadow curled up beside him, and pulled out an old photo album. Page after page revealed memories of Sam. His playful antics, his love for the outdoors, the way he always seemed to know when Daniel needed comfort. Shadow stirred, resting his head on Daniel's lap. Daniel held up a photo of Sam in the park, standing proudly with a stick in his mouth. "You'd have loved him," he said quietly. "He was one of a kind, just like you." As if understanding, Shadow nuzzled closer, his warm presence filling the room with a sense of peace. The next day, Daniel decided to visit Sam's grave. A small plot in the backyard marked by a simple stone engraved with Sam's name and the words, "Forever loyal, forever love." Shadow followed him outside, his steps measured and deliberate. Daniel knelt by the grave, placing a small bouquet of daisies, a favorite memory of Sam's habit of bounding through wildflower fields. "Hey buddy," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "It's been a while." Shadow sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the grave, as if he too were paying his respects. Daniel smiled through his tears. "You'd like Shadow. He's got your heart, your loyalty. I swear sometimes I see you in him." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above, and for a moment Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of connection, as if Sam was there with him, reassuring him. Shadow leaned against Daniel, grounding him in the present while honoring the past. As they walked back to the house, Daniel felt lighter, as though a weight he knew he'd been carrying had been lifted. Shadow walked cheerfully beside him, his tail wagging with every stride. Inside, Daniel pulled out Sam's old collar from a box he'd kept of his belongings. He held it out to Shadow, who sniffed it curiously before wagging his tail. With a deep breath, Daniel clipped the collar around Shadow's neck. "It's yours now," he said. "Sam would want you to have it." Shadow barked softly, his eyes shining with gratitude. The connection between them felt undeniable, a bridge between past and present that allowed Daniel to embrace the love he'd lost while honoring his newfound affection. Shadow was more than simply a dog. He was a second chance, a living reminder that, despite loss, life managed to provide unforeseen blessings. During the weeks that following, Daniel and Shadow created a routine that based around camaraderie, adventure, and healing. Early mornings were spent jogging through the neighborhood park. Shadow, eager energy, pulling Daniel out of bed. Even on days when the weight of grief tried to anchor him, afternoons often found him at the dog park or exploring the hiking paths on the outskirts of town, areas Daniel had avoided since Sam's passing one particular Saturday. Daniel and Shadow started on a lengthier journey to a scenic overlook noted for its stunning views of the valley below. The trail was tough but manageable, snaking through lush woodlands, and over shallow creek. Shadow led the way, his instincts guiding them, while Daniel marveled at the dog's seemingly boundless energy. Halfway through the hike, they reached a clearing where sunlight streamed through the canopy, illuminating a small meadow filled with wildflowers. Shadow paused, his ears perking up as he inspected the spot. Daniel knelt beside. With a hint of nostalgia in his voice, he remarked, "This reminds me of a spot Sam loved. He would have gone crazy here, chasing butterflies and rolling around as if on cue." Shadow darted into the meadow, leaping through the flowers with unrestrained joy. Daniel laughed, the sound feeling foreign yet soothing, like a long-lost buddy returning. Shadow's antics brought memories of Sam racing back, not in a painful way, but in a way that reminded Daniel of the happiness they'd shared as they continued the hike. Daniel's thoughts strayed to the wording on Sam's collar, now laying around Shadow's neck. "When there is love, there is no." He had chosen those words in the midst of his grief, not knowing if he would ever genuinely deceive them. But now, observing Shadow traverse the rugged terrain with the same tenacity Sam once possessed, demonstrated that when they eventually arrived at the overlook, he could feel their truth resonate. Daniel sat on a large rock, the sprawling valley below taking his breath away. With his head resting on Daniel's knee, Shadow took up residence next to him. The view was breathtaking, but what really stood out was the calm connection between man and dog that held Daniel focused. He ran a hand through Shadow's fur. His voice was hardly audible beyond a whisper, "But you've revived me." You were aware that the Shadow licked Daniel's hand and eyes. Imbued with a peaceful knowledge, for a moment the universe felt perfectly aligned. Back in town, the impact Shadow had on Daniel's life hadn't gone unnoticed. Friends and neighbors commented on the improvements they saw in him, the way he smiled more often, the enthusiasm that. During one of their weekly phone conversations, Daniel's sister Emma even said, "It's like you're a different person." "Shadow's been good for you." Daniel smiled, glancing at Shadow, who was stretched on the living room carpeting, nibbling on a squeaky toy. "He's more than good for me," Daniel said. "He's everything I didn't realize I needed." One day, while rummaging through old boxes in the attic, Daniel discovered a dusty picture album full of Sam's photos, including ones from their adventures, beach vacations, mountain hikes, and leisurely afternoons in the backyard. Shadow sat nearby, watching curiously as Daniel flipped through the pages. Daniel halted on a shot of Sam sitting triumphantly with a stick twice his size. He turned the album to show Shadow. "That's your predecessor," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. He set a high bar, "But I think you're doing a pretty good job." Shadow tilted his head, then barked as if to say. After accepting the challenge, Daniel made the decision to go to the animal shelter the following day. When he saw Shadow, and he carried him along a gift of food, blankets, and toys because he felt obligated to return the favor to the location that had given him so much. Shadow trotted beside him, his tail wagging enthusiastically as they approached the shelter. Inside, Daniel was greeted by a staff member who recognized him. "Shadow looks beautiful," she remarked, kneeling to pet the dog. "You've given him a great home," Daniel said, looking at Shadow with a look of intense admiration. "He's done more for me than I've done for him. I can't thank you enough for bringing us together." As they strolled into the shelter, Daniel observed a young couple looking at the adoptable dogs, a small terrier mix caught their eyes, wagging tail and joyous barks bringing grins to their faces. Daniel felt a thrill of hope, knowing that another puppy was ready to find its everlasting home that evening. As Daniel and Shadow rested on the couch, Daniel brought out his phone and browsed through his texts. Among them was a text from Emma. "You're inspiring me to consider and adopting a dog. Any advice?" Daniel grinned and replied back, "Do it. You won't only save a dog, you'll save yourself too." As the darkness deepened, Shadow was sleeping at his feet as Daniel sat in the silence of his living room, reflecting on how far he'd come since the day he walked into the shelter broken and unsure. Shadow had been more than a companion. He'd been a lifeline, eh? Looking down at the dog, Daniel muttered, "Thank you, Shadow, for everything you stirred." This was a bridge between grief and hope. Quickly, his tail pounding on the floor, before he went back in his calm slumber, Daniel leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sense of thankfulness flood his heart. The tie between Daniel and Shadow only grew. As the days stretched into weeks, they grew closer and more inseparable, enduring life's highs and lows together. Every morning started with Shadow nudging Daniel awake, ready for their morning routine. Their days were filled. Through adventure, humor, and quiet introspection, Daniel discovered that he was changing in ways he hadn't expected. That one crisp autumn afternoon, Shadow's unwavering presence would lighten his once heavy heart. Daniel made the decision to go back to a particular hiking trail that he and Sam had used. It was a location full of. He initially paused, uncertain if he was able to recall both happy and bittersweet experiences, prepared to face such feelings. But with Shadow at his side, Daniel experienced a newfound sense of bravery that went beyond simply about paying tribute to Sam and commemorating the path that led him to this point. The path wound through dense woods, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot echoing in the crisp air. Shadow, constantly eager and full of enthusiasm, rushed ahead, sniffing every tree and chasing after the occasional falling leaf. Daniel observed Shadow's excitement as they drew closer, a tiny smile flickering across his lips. Daniel experienced a lump in his throat from the vivid memories of the clearing where he and Sam had frequently stopped to rest. Sam leaping across the tall grass, his joyous barks filling the air. He briefly closed his eyes to allow the memories to flood his mind, then opened them, glanced at Shadow, who was observing him closely, head cocked as though he could sense Daniel's feelings. This was Sam's favorite spot, Daniel said, softly kneeling to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "I believe you would be pleased that we came here." Shadow leaned toward Daniel, his warm fur providing a reassuring presence against the. After adopting Shadow, Daniel began maintaining a little leather-bound journal, which he took out as he sat down, opened it to a blank page, and began to write. "Today, we walked a path I thought I'd never take again, but with Shadow by, it felt lighter on my side, as if the past and present were moving in unison rather than conflict. If you're looking, Sam's, I appreciate you guiding me here. Shadow, I appreciate you." Daniel saw something glinting in the clearing as they left it and resumed their hike, assisting me in moving forward. Curious about the sunlight up ahead, he accelerated, with the Shadow following closely behind. Nestled between two rocks was a small rusted tag attached to a broken chain. Daniel picked it up and turned it over. Even though the engraving was faint in his hands, Buddy's name could still be read for A. When Daniel thought of another dog who might have been loved and lost, he briefly experienced a pang of sadness before grinning. "Belongs to," he told Shadow, slipping the tag into his pocket back at home. Daniel, after cleaning the tag, he started looking for leads online through a few social media groups and local pet forums. Shared a picture of the tag with a note asking if it belonged to you or someone you know. "I found it on Maple Ridge Trail. Please get in touch with him." His unexpected responses came in practically instantly. Even while none of them immediately pointed to the owner, one letter in particular struck his eye. It was from a woman named Carla, who explained that her dog Buddy had gone missing 5 years ago on the very same trail. She thanked Daniel for his generosity, but dared not think it was him. Feeling driven to assist Daniel and Shadow, Carla met them at the trailhead the following morning and brought some pictures of. As Daniel saw the photos, he had a strange feeling that Buddy, a golden retriever with soulful eyes and a cheerful smile. In the meantime, Shadow cautiously walked up to Carla, his tail wagging slowly. "You're such a handsome boy," Carla remarked quietly as she bent down and held out her hand. "Even if we don't find a friend, knowing that people like you are out there makes our eyes meet Daniel's," and they were filled with gratitude. "There, and it signifies everything." The following days were devoted to searching for any indications of his friend or fate. Even though they didn't learn much, the experience gave Carla closure and bolstered Daniel's faith in the significance of community and connection. Shadow's part in all this wasn't lost on Daniel. His dog wasn't. Shadow was more than simply a friend. He served as a link between the past, present, and future. As Daniel sat on the porch one evening, he spoke of bringing people together, healing old wounds, and forming new relationships. He thought about how much had changed since the day he found Shadow as he watched the sunset with Shadow curled up at his feet, reflected on Sam Buddy and all the dogs who had made a lasting impression on their human companions. Love, he realized, was never truly lost. It simply changed forms, finding new ways to. Daniel grinned as he looked down at Shadow and offered consolation and guidance to those left behind. His voice was full of appreciation as he said, "You've given me more than I could ever give you." Shadow replied with a joyful. The morning broke with a wag of his tail and eyes full of the unwavering love that only a dog could provide. As Daniel and Shadow embarked on their favorite ritual, a stroll along the maple ridge, he was soft and golden. Trail this time, but the tag Daniel gave them a fresh sense of direction. Discovered had provoked not just a hunt for its owner, but also a more thorough examination of the intimate bonds we develop with our pets and the legacies they leave behind. As they reached the trail's midpoint, Daniel noticed a group of when hikers gathered close to the clearing where he had previously discovered the tag. His interest was piqued, so he went up to them with. Carla was among the bunch, Shadow jogging faithfully by his side, while clutching a small framed picture of Buddy. Daniel's look was one of cautious optimism and fear as she cried out, her voice echoing over the rustle of the leaves. "I didn't think you'd be here," Daniel grinned as he approached. "I couldn't resist taking another walk with Shadow." "What's going on?" Carla paused, then pointed to an elderly couple. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper are standing close by. They read your post regarding the tag and got in touch since they believe it might." The Harpers, who belonged to their son's dog, came up, their features etched with the years and grief of our son Tim. "Passed away a few years ago," Mrs. Harper explained, her voice trembling. "Buddy was his dog. He ran off shortly after Tim's accident. We searched everywhere, but we never located him." Daniel felt a lump form. "This might be a long shot," he murmured softly as he reached into his pocket and took out the cleansed tag in his throat. As she gave it to them, Miss Harper held the tag while her eyes filled with tears. "This is Buddy's tag," she muttered, holding it firmly. As the group stood in the clearing, a gentle bark came from Daniel, and Shadow turned to face the sound deeper in the woods. "Did you hear that?" Carla asked, her voice tinted with excitement. Another bark followed closer. This time Shadow perked up his tail, bouncing frantically as he let. Before anyone could react, a golden retriever came out of the trees and let out a replying bark of his own, coat covered in leaves, but his eyes are lively and bright. "Friend Mrs. Harper." Her voice broke with emotion as she shouted out, and the dog halted for a moment, perhaps struggling to take in the familiar sound. Then with a burst of energy he ran straight into her arms. The scene that unfolded was one of pure, unfiltered joy. Mrs. Harper gave her friend a tight hug while sobbing uncontrollably and whispering kind words of comfort and affection. Mr. Harper knelt beside her, stroking Buddy's head with trembling hands. Carla wiped away tears of her own hope. Daniel's heart grew as he watched in amazement as Shadow stood's reunion turned into a radiant smile. Carla remarked, "This is amazing," as he waggled his tail beside him, seemingly understanding the moment's significance. Daniel shook his head as they turned to him. "Because of you, their friend." Placing a hand on Shadow's back, "It's because of him," he said, his voice thick. Shadow's ability to emotionally unite people is evident in the Harpers' sharing of tales of Tim and Buddy. Daniel experienced a deep feeling of closure for themselves, as well as Sam, not only for the Harpers. Remembrance, Shadow's presence, and now Buddy's return had formed a tapestry of love and connection that felt almost cosmic in its design. Before the group parted ways, Mrs. Harper approached Daniel with a. She smiled heartily and added, "Thank you for finding my friend and bringing him back to me. You've given us more than you know." Us, Daniel nodded, overwhelmed by her thanks. It wasn't just me, it was fate that Daniel and Shadow sat on his porch together that night. Beside the stars twinkled above them, a silent reminder of the vastness of the universe and the small but significant connections in it. He took out his journal, and I saw him write today. Something remarkable. A family reunion with a renewed bond. Reminded me. Shadow, Sam's friend, has taught me that love is a force that endures beyond death, time, and sorrow. Relationship, no matter how brief, makes a mark on our psyche, and those imprints lead us to recovery and hoped Daniel shut the journal and glanced down at Shadow, who was observing him with those. He ruffled the fur on Shadow's neck and asked, his deep knowing eyes ready for bed. Lad. Yes, they made their way inside. Shadow leaned into Daniel's hand and gave a soft woof. A week had gone by when Daniel experienced a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just healing, he was entire. Daniel stood in his living room in the gentle warmth of the trail's incredible reunion act. On the sofa table was a framed picture of Sam, and a lamp was shining loving light on Shadow S.E., who was snuggled up near his feet. With Shadow's adoption documents a try to the relationships that had molded his existence. The events of the past week had left Daniel reflected the Harpers had visited him just a day after their reunion, during which Buddy brought a baked pie and continued to tell stories about Tim and Buddy's unbreakable bond. Thanks to the generosity of hikers who left scraps, that friend had been surviving in the woods next to the trail for years. Of food behind, and when Daniel discovered the tag, it seemed as though destiny had stepped in to lead his friend home. Daniel turned to face Shadow. She moved slightly, catching his stare. You've been my constant through all of this, Daniel said softly, leaning down to. I'm not sure how I was so fortunate. But the doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Daniel opened the door to find Carla standing there holding a scrapbook. I thought you'd like to see this, she said, stepping inside. They sat on the couch together as Carla pulled out the scrapbook, which contained pictures of Buddy and Tim taken in. Moments of joy and adventure. The Harpers wanted you to have a copy, Carla explained. They said it's their way of. Daniel thanked him and turned the pages, stopping at a photo of Tim and Buddy by Golden Lake. Retriever's coat sparkled in the sunlight as Tim's arm lay around him, both of them smiling at the camera. It's beautiful, Daniel remarked in a passionate voice. I'll cherish it, as Carla. She was about to leave, but she stopped at the door. Daniel, you've done more than just bring a family back together. You've reminded everyone of. Daniel grinned as he watched her walk down the stairs, demonstrating to us the power of love and connection. The stairs shut the door and faced Shadow again. She was correct. He continued. Having been reminded of what truly counts, Daniel made the decision to post the story online that evening while seated at his desk. Meticulously typed up the reunion specifics, including the surprising bond between Tim and his friend and how Shadow's instinct and the missing tag had ignited it all. He closed the post with a meaningful remark. This experience has taught me that love, whether between people or animals, has the potential to overcome grief and bring us together. If you've ever loved a pet or been moved by their devotion, tell us about it. Together, we can honor these relationships that enhance life and serve as a reminder us of what genuinely counts. The answer was overwhelming among our stories. From around the world began coming in individuals sharing tales of their own dogs' acts of compassion and moments of serendipity. Daniel read each comment with Shadow by his side, feeling a sense of community that stretched far beyond his quiet. He was inspired by his story to start a local animal shelter after receiving a message in a small town. Daniel grinned when the letter inquired, "Would you and Shadow like to be the faces of our campaign?" He said, "We have more work to do, Buddy," and the dog ruffled Shadow's fur in response. With a wag of his tail, as if eager for the next venture on the day of the adoption drive, Daniel and Shadow stood. With volunteers and hopeful families gathered outside the shelter, kids petted Shadow, who reveled in the attention while Daniel shared his story with anyone who would listen. One family drew Daniel's notice, a small child holding the leash of a shy terrier mix. The boy's eyes widened as he gazed up at Daniel. "Is Sammy," he said. "She's called after someone incredibly special." Daniel knelt down to the boy's level, his heart swelling. With much emotion, Sam would have appreciated that. He stated, "You're going to give her an amazing life," as the day wound down and the last of the dogs found homes. Daniel reflected on how far he had come. The pain of losing Sam had once felt impenetrable, but now standing near Shadow, he felt that love had extended his heart rather than lessened it. He looked at Shadow, who peered back with unflinching loyalty. "We're making a difference," he said, "and we're just getting started." The story ended as it began, with Daniel and Shadow going along the Maple Ridge Trail, but this time the route felt brighter. Their steps, with the golden light of sunset bathing the woodland, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. Everything in a warm glow. Daniel paused at the clearing where he had first found the tag, letting the memories wash over. "You've taught me so much," he replied, reaching down to pat Shadow's head. Devotion, tenacity, and the wonder of unforeseen relationships. Shadow waggled his tail as though to convey that the best is still to come. As they continued down the trail, the silver tag hung from Shadow's collar, capturing the final rays of sunlight, a sign of the love that had brought them here, and the trip still ahead. If this story moved you, consider how many other lives you can influence by opening your heart to a shelter animal or sponsoring adoption initiatives. Every bond begins with a single step. Make a difference now, and don't miss the next heartwarming tale of love and dedication.